This is Karen Hudes, and I'm here to tell you about the network of global corporate control. But first, let me tell you a little bit about myself so you know why it is that I want to tell you about the network of global corporate control. I'm a lawyer who worked in the World Bank legal department for 21 years, and after 10 years, things didn't add up, and I started blowing the whistle inside the World Bank, which is what you're supposed to do if you're a lawyer. But I actually knew when I went into the World Bank that it wasn't going to be peaches and cream, because the man who had been there when the World Bank was established in 1944, he was a young Dutch lawyer at the time. His name was Aaron Broches. By the time I got to know him, he was in his 80s, and he gave me the operation manual for the World Bank. He told me that that place got really corrupt when Robert McNamara went there in 1968, and it has been going downhill ever since. So I knew that that was going to be a problem, but I had no idea what kind of corruption I was going to be exposed to. But I started working together with whistleblowers inside the World Bank, and then after a while, I went up the corporate ladder, and I'll tell you all about the corruption that I was reporting. But at the same time I was doing that, I knew that we could win against that corruption, because the thing about the World Bank is it's a knowledge bank. It's a cooperative of all the world's countries. And a lot of people are very angry at the World Bank because it's been doing horrible things. It's been creating debt for all of the countries. And the thing is, the World Bank is actually sitting on a trust fund for all of the world's wealth. I didn't know this at the time, but as I was explaining, I did know that we could win against the corruption. And we are going to win against the corruption. The chances that we in the world get the world's wealth that belongs to all of humanity is 90 to 95%. And I can say that with absolute clarity, because I was talking to Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel about a very powerful political science modeling tool that came to the World Bank in 2004. Jacek Kugler, who's a political scientist, developed this model for the Department of Defense. And when I spoke to Chuck Hagel about that model, he was then Senator of Nebraska. And 3 days before Chuck Hagel was asked to resign, we were talking about court-martialing some of the senior people in the military who were actually not defending the United States. What they were doing was working as Knights of Malta for the network of global corporate control. But first, let me tell you a little bit about this political science modeling tool so you know how accurate it is. What it does is it predicts how coalitions will form. And it predicted back in 2004 that the United States was going to lose something called the Gentleman's Agreement. When the World Bank and its sister organization were created in 1944, there was a Gentleman's Agreement put into place, which is that the United States was going to name the president of the World Bank, and the Europeans were going to name the managing director of the International Monetary Fund. Now, what is it that those two organizations are supposed to be doing? The IMF is supposed to make sure that the world's currencies function. And guess what? We are sitting on the very edge of the dark ages. The paper currencies are not functioning. Paper currencies always crash. And the United States isn't supposed to have Federal Reserve notes. Those are unconstitutional. The reason we have that is because of this network. The way that money works today is with the paper currencies, the money is actually based on debt. Whenever you make a loan, money comes into existence magically on the computer screen. And when paper currency is printed, the Federal Reserve gets to keep the difference between what it costs to print that currency and the face amount of the bill. And that's just for starters, because then they charge interest on country debt. Let me tell you what I did on the 9th of March, because this coalition that the power transition model was predicting is actually now in the process of straightening out all of the problems that we've been having. What was one of the big problems we had in the United States? John F. Kennedy, 10 days before he was assassinated, had signed something called the Green-Hilton Agreement. This was an agreement that gave the United States access to the gold that's in a special trust fund that the World Bank and the IMF are sitting on top of. This trust fund was put aside at the end of World War II by Jose Rizal, who had actually come from the Vatican. He was something called the Black Pope, and his lawyer was Ferdinand Marcos. Not very many people know about this role. And one of the reasons we don't know about a lot of things that we should know about is because of this network of global corporate control. It has bought up all the media. It has frightened all of the academics. It has also prevented many good academics from getting tenure, because if they don't toe the line, they're not given tenure. So what happened with this network is it has been hijacking the World Bank and the IMF. It has been censoring all of the news. That's one of the reasons that many of you don't know what this corruption is that we're telling you about. The corruption is that our money is actually, it's a system to control humanity. The 60 central banks that belong to something called the Bank for International Settlements are charging interest on our country debt. That's actually a big scam. What is supposed to happen is that the treasuries of the countries are supposed to issue the currency. So the difference between what it costs to print the currency and the face amount of the bill stays with the country, and there is no country debt. So what this coalition that I'm telling you about, have already announced is that all of the country debts are going to be extinguished. How are we going to do this? Because this trust that I was telling you about, that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are sitting on top of, this trust also contains promises of the Federal Reserve. When the gold was collected, that was done by Yamashita just before World War II. He went around warning people that it wasn't safe to hold the gold, and so the Federal Reserve gave notes in exchange for the gold. How much gold is there in this trust? When I tell you, you're not going to believe it, because it's much more gold than the GATA talks about. It's actually 1,715,000 metric tons. Now, a lot of people say this is impossible because gold is not easy to mine. It takes a long time. And if you add up the number of years that people have been mining gold, you come up with either a small figure or a large figure based on how long you think our history is. It turns out that our history is a lot longer than we think. And one of the proofs of this is the maps. There's something called a Hapgood map, which was in the 1500s. This map showed the coastline of Antarctica without the ice, and it was very accurately drawn. Now, this couldn't have happened unless there was a very good cartographer in the previous ice age. And you can also see off the coasts of many countries ruins of an ancient civilization. This civilization was probably there before the flood happened. The flood happened when the ice melted, and now the oceans are about 400 feet higher than they were in the previous ice age. So we've been mining gold a lot longer. And this gold, where does it come from? It comes from the Incas. It comes from the Aztecs. It comes from King Solomon. And it's there. And that gold is what John F. Kennedy had tapped into with this Green-Hilton Agreement 10 days before he was assassinated. And Ronald Reagan was also shot because he didn't want us to have to pay interest on country debt either. He printed dollars, uncut dollars, which are also in the global debt facility. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to take those Treasury dollars and we're going to exchange them for the Federal Reserve notes so that we don't have to pay interest on our country debt. And all of the other countries that have country debt are going to subtract what the Fed owes us because of these. How much does the Fed owe us? The notes that were issued when the gold was collected by Yamashita, that was $210 trillion, but that has been compounding interest since the 30s. It's now in the quadrillions. And what I did on behalf of the 188 countries that are members of the World Bank is I filed a notice of a lien against the 12 Federal Reserve banks. And what happened was I got a letter a couple of days ago from the Secretary of State, that's where you file these liens, of Illinois for the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, Jesse White. He wrote me and he said, Karen, I'd like you to prove, I'm giving you 30 days to prove that the Fed really owes you that money. So what I did was I wrote back to all of the ministers of finance and I told them about this letter from the Secretary of State of Illinois. And I gave them a copy of the draft response. My draft response said as follows. I went and read the statute, and the statute had an exemption for a bank that was regulated. Well, the World Bank happens to be regulated by something called the National Advisory Council on International Monetary and Financial Policies. That's headed by the Secretary of the Treasury. It has all of the agencies of the United States as members that have to do with economics, including the Export-Import Bank, where I had worked before I went to the World Bank. It also has the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board on it. So I said, since I was a representative of a regulated bank, because the World Bank is administering this global debt facility, I said we were exempt and we didn't have to prove anything. But I did put copies of some of the documentation. What was some of the documentation? Well, it turns out that the Federal Reserve was trying to buy up these certificates. And under the terms of the trust, the World Bank and the IMF have to agree on whether those certificates could be sold. And I said, no, I don't agree, because the ministers of finance have delegated that duty to consent to me. And I said, no, I don't consent, so they couldn't do the deal. So I showed a copy of that transaction. And by the way, I tweet all of the documents, so I'm very happy to show anybody who's listening to this what my lack of consent for that $2 quadrillion transaction was. And then I also showed copies of the Treaty of Versailles bonds, that's what they're called. And I showed a couple of other documents, including the UCC filings. So I have had a conversation with the ministers of finance for many, many years. One of the conversations I had to do with when the board decided to fire Paul Wolfowitz. They fired him because he had a girlfriend, Shaha Riza, that he gave a 30% raise to when he came to the World Bank as the World Bank president. And the board didn't like that, and they fired Paul Wolfowitz. Well, Herman Wijfels was the man who represented the Dutch government, and I happen to speak Dutch because I studied development economics in Holland. I did that right when they were saying love it or leave it during the Vietnam War, and I was very upset about the Vietnam War. So I left, and I went to Holland, and I studied development economics. Anyway, so I spoke Dutch, and I happened to be in Holland when Herman Wijfels was complaining. He was the member of the board. He represented the Dutch government. He was the member of the board who was in charge of firing Paul Wolfowitz. And what he said was that any board member who went to the New York Madam was told that that information was going to be made public if they continued to fire Paul Wolfowitz. Well, the board continued to fire him. But anyway, when I found that out, I went back to the States. I had been talking to the Congress by that time because of all the corruption at the World Bank. I'd been blowing the whistle at Congress, and Congress had been responding. Senator Lugar wrote 3 letters to the World Bank and said, don't fire this lady. And of course, they promptly fired me. So after they fired me, that's when 3 senators asked for a GAO inquiry into corruption at the World Bank. That was Senators Lugar, Leahy, and Bai. And the World Bank refused to cooperate with the GAO. So that's when the U.S. Congress said that they were not going to allow the World Bank to access its capital increase, because usually the World Bank doesn't have to go to Congress for money. What they do is they invest money on the capital market. But when they need a capital increase, that's when the countries do have to appropriate money. And so the Congress said to the World Bank, since you can't be bothered to answer GAO's questions about corruption, we're not going to allow you to disperse any of this money for the capital increase. And they also said that the World Bank had to make the effects of retaliation against whistleblowers eliminated. And so all of the whistleblowers that I've been working with from the World Bank, and we're waiting to go back in the World Bank and clean up the place, because it really needs a lot of work, obviously. There's been something called state capture. But the fact of the matter is the state capture is not just at the World Bank. The state capture is in the United States. It's in just about every country of the world, except for those countries that we say are corrupt. That's usually an indicator that those countries are doing okay, actually. So when I say what is state capture, what that means is that the politicians, instead of doing what they're supposed to be doing, representing their constituents, for example, at the U.S. Congress, they're actually representing the network of global corporate control. Let me explain what the network is. It is all of the banks. The banks are actually one bank. And the reason we can talk about it with very good accuracy is because 3 mathematicians at the Federal Institute of Technology looked at who owns all of the companies on the capital markets, and they modeled this. And what they found out was that this network that's interconnected, they did it in a very clever way. They took the same directors and they put them on interlocking boards in something that they call a bow tie arrangement. And then in that way, they were able to basically, they're part of all of the Bank for International Settlement. They were able to just take over. They bought all of the media. And so when you look at the news, what you're really hearing is something which has been very carefully censored and tailored to manipulate you in a way that, that you probably haven't realized just how monolithic this network is. And a good way to understand how your understanding of reality has been manipulated is to look at The Wizard of Oz. Frank Baum, when he wrote that, this was just before the Federal Reserve came into being. He wrote it in 1910, I believe, and the Federal Reserve came into effect in 1913. Well, this was actually, he knew what this network of global corporate control was very, very well. And where we are right now, if you remember the scene where Toto the dog pulls back the curtain and Dorothy and the Tin Man and the lion, who am I forgetting? Anyway, they see that this projection screen is actually just a projection screen, and that it's this wizard who's pulling the levers. Well, the wizard is this network of global corporate control, and the projection screen, that's what you're hearing on the mainstream media, and actually also in some of the alternate media, because this network has also bought up a lot of the alternate media as well. For example, Reddit. You know what happened to Adam Schwartz. He suicided himself when he was supposed to get out of jail. And that's when Condé Nast bought Reddit. And one of the things that happened with me trying to get my story out was Reddit put one article up, which wasn't really very accurate. And then when I tried to respond to some of the questions, they wouldn't allow me to respond. And then a year or two later, when more people had heard about some of the disclosures that the World Bank whistleblowers have been making, then Reddit invited me to come and do a question and answer session. But they were editing my answers, so I finally said, look, I'm sorry, this is not a forum where I can actually seriously answer any questions. So you have to be very critical about the alternate media. One of the things that will help you understand about the state capture in the United States is what our laws actually are. And that is that the banks created a second secret constitution in the District of Columbia in 1861. That was when we started having war powers at the end of Civil War. Those war powers have never been ended. We have been under military rule since 1861, and it was in 1871 that we had the District of Columbia, the Act of the District of Columbia, created a second secret constitution where the United States government was turned actually into a corporation. And it sounds improbable. The first time I read this, I couldn't believe it either. But unfortunately, this happens to be the case. And many other countries have also been turned into corporations. And the way this works, our courts, they're not what you're expecting under the Constitution, the Article 3 courts, where you have rights under the Constitution. What we have, our court system, is actually administrative hearings, and the judges are all employees of this corporation. I found out about this because people will send me information. There was a clerk of the New York courts in the mid-'80s named George Mercier, and he wrote something called Invisible Contracts, a book. And what happens when you sign a signature, when you open a bank account, there's very fine print underneath which says subject to bank rules. And if you look inside to see what those rules are, the rules are that you have waived your right to courts. You didn't know you waived them, but the courts believe you have. And so you're really not protected under the constitutional rights. Now, we don't have to worry, actually. This sounds like a terrible state of affairs, but the founding fathers knew about this network of global corporate control. It was called something else in their day, but that was the reason they left Europe. They were trying to get away from that. And so what they did was, in our Constitution, there's something called Article 5, which says that you have the right to a constitutional convention. Under our Constitution, it says that it's we, the people, that have a right to consent. And so if 2/3 of the state legislatures ask for an amendment of the Constitution, there's supposed to be a conference called by the Congress. But since the Congress have been secretly extending military rule without telling us, they're not prepared to convene the Constitutional Convention, although the 2/3 number has already been met. It was met back at the end of the 20s, and they're still refusing to grant the conference that they're supposed to give us. But since all of the countries of the world are suffering just as badly, we are now in a coalition. What is that coalition? It's the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's Germany. And now a number of European countries have also given notice that they're joining that coalition. It's a coalition for the rule of law. And in the United States, all we have to do is get rid of the unconstitutional Federal Reserve notes, and we can also join that coalition for the rule of law. The chances that we do that, it's 90 to 95% under that power transition model, which is very, very accurate. So, but it's not going to happen automatically. And that's the reason why I wanted to be giving this series of public broadcasts, because it's very important for people to learn about this reality, to turn off their mainstream media, to turn off their regular news, and to work together with their friends to figure out what's really going on. It's actually a very interesting thing to do. You have to compare and contrast. You have to use critical thinking. And we're very happy, those of us who have been understanding what the real reality is, those of us who have been looking at the projection screen and realizing that the reality is actually you have to keep your focus on the wizard and see what the wizard is up to. But the good news, as I was saying, is that this coalition for the rule of law is much stronger than that network of global corporate control. In the next broadcast, I'm going to be talking to you about some of your problems, because you have been treated as a company yourself, whether you knew it or not. And the taxes that you've been paying, you didn't have to be paying them because they're leaving the country. That's what Ronald Reagan discovered with something called the Grace Commission. He found out that 100% of our income taxes were going to the network of global corporate control to pay interest on our country debt, which is a scam. So what we're going to be talking about in the next broadcast is we're going to be talking about what some of the citizens who understand what the reality is, what they've been doing, and also what this coalition is about to do. Hello, this is Karen Hudes for the second in the series on the network of global corporate control. That's a mouthful. What we're talking about is the fact that there's really one big bank. It's not separate big banks. It's not one too big to fail bank. It's a whole network that is in control of 40% of the assets of the 40,000 companies that are traded on the capital markets, and they're pulling down 60% of the earnings of those companies. They bought those companies by printing paper currency and keeping the difference between what it cost them to print that currency and the face value of the bill. And there's also money that's created just on a computer screen. They didn't even have to pay any money for that currency. And then they have the nerve to charge us interest on country debt. And as I explained last week, there's actually a trust that contains all of the world's assets, 1,715,000 metric tons of gold, which is more gold than most people think exists on the earth. And I explained that that's because our history is much longer than we think. Our history doesn't go back 6,000 or 7,000 years. Our history goes back to the previous ice age, and we can tell because there are maps that show the landmass in Antarctica. So that's just a brief summary. Let's go forward with our story, because it's actually a story about how all the countries of the world don't want this corruption anymore, and we're all working together to get rid of it. We're working through the Board of Governors of the Bretton Woods institutions. The Bretton Woods institutions, that's the World Bank and the IMF. And there are a lot of people that say, how can that possibly be? Because the World Bank and the IMF are actually doing terrible things to countries. This is because there's a real difference, actually, between what the World Bank and the IMF are doing, their staff. They're runaway. They've been hijacked. They've had state capture by this network of global corporate control. But the Articles of Agreement of the World Bank say that it's actually the Board of Governors that are supposed to be in charge. And that's how we're taking back our wealth. Because as a lawyer inside the World Bank, I was there for 21 years until I was fired illegally against the protests of Senator Lugar and some of the other members of Congress that realized that we had to take a stand against this state capture. So anyway, I didn't know at the time that the World Bank was sitting on what is called the Global Debt Facility, but I'm now the lawyer for the Global Debt Facility. And so I've been working with 188 ministers of finance to take back the world's wealth. And that's exactly what we're doing. We issued a press release on the 9th of March in which we said that the Federal Reserve was bankrupt because it had issued $210 trillion worth of bonds when they gathered up gold. And those bonds have been earning interest, and the interest has been compounding. So they're getting a taste of their own medicine. Then I did something which is called a notarial protest. I asked the Federal Reserve to answer whether they had the gold monetary reserves of the United States, and they refused to answer. And I kept on asking them and sending certified letters to the Postmaster General of the United States, that's now Megan Brennan, and I also copied the Director General of the Universal Postal Union in Switzerland, and we have actually foreclosed on the Fed. And it was very interesting because this press release, obviously the World Bank didn't like that very much. So they called up the company that had issued the press release and protested. And I explained that I had cleared the press release with 188 ministers of finance and that it was an accurate press release. And the problem was that the people inside the World Bank and the IMF were disobeying the ministers of finance, and that's not going to continue. That's the nice thing about it. It's not going to continue. This power transition model that I was talking about that came out of the Department of Defense talked about how there would be a coalition for the rule of law that would be stronger than the network of global corporate control. And that's actually what is the case. Now let's talk a little bit about the United States military and how this state capture looks in the United States. There was a terrible attempt to drop a nuclear bomb on Charleston, South Carolina in 2013. It was on September 8th. What happened was they activated the nuclear bomb and they flew it across the country. And some people saw it land in the Air Force Base in South Carolina, in Charleston. And the very next day, two military heroes, Vice Admiral Tim Giardina and Major General Michael Carey, they took that activated nuclear device, and rather than dropping it on the citizens of Charleston, they dropped it off the coast. And we can tell that it dropped off the coast because there was an earthquake, which didn't look like an earthquake. When you have an earthquake, a real earthquake, it builds up. It doesn't just detonate in one burst. And also, the Russians intercepted naval cables. And so right now, I believe that this matter is being raised in the run-up to the presidential elections. Rick Santorum, when he was in South Carolina, was asked by one of the constituents there what he thought about that. And of course, he didn't want to deal with the issue. Many of the politicians don't want to deal with these issues. I had mentioned in the previous broadcast about how the board at the World Bank had fired Paul Wolfowitz when he gave an exorbitant pay raise to his girlfriend who happened to work at the World Bank. And the board persisted in firing Paul Wolfowitz, but they also knew that it was going to be difficult to maintain the direction of the World Bank because it has been hijacked. The president of the World Bank, Jim Kim, and the managing director of the IMF, they're defying the board, and they're defying the board of governors at the World Bank. There was a rule that came into effect just 2 years after the World Bank was created, which said that the board would vote up or down whatever the president had proposed. They wouldn't take the initiative themselves. And in 2009, I gave a legal opinion to the board saying that because of all the corruption, they were actually required to take the initiative. And that was when I was locked out of the World Bank. The security firm for the World Bank, Allied Barton, is actually a subsidiary of the banking cartel, and they're refusing to follow the direction of the board. Now, you can't have that, obviously, and there has to be a transition. And the only way that the transition is really going to happen is if people understand what the consequences are if we allow this network of global corporate control to have their way when they actually don't own the world's assets. Those assets are in this trust for the benefit of humanity. And I have filed UCC-1 forms. That's what you do when you're a creditor and you want to show that a borrower owes you money. So I filed UCC forms in all of the 12 Federal Reserve banks saying that those banks owe us more than we owe them. And that's when the Secretary of State for Illinois sent me a letter saying I had to prove this debt. So what I did was I sent a letter to all of the New York embassies and the Tokyo embassies, and I asked them to clear the letter, which said that we were not required to answer to the Secretary of State of Illinois because the World Bank was a regulated, lending institution, and it's regulated by the National Advisory Council on International Monetary and Financial Policies. So this letter, it's actually landing today in Chicago. So stay tuned. We're going to see what actually happens. Now, what we're going to do, because the likelihood that we, the network, the Coalition for the Rule of Law, that we are able to defeat this network of global corporate control, it's 90 to 95% based on this very accurate power transition model. Let me tell you what the model is describing. It's describing that Germany is going to leave the NATO, it's going to leave the Transatlantic Alliance, and it's going to ally itself with Russia and with the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, these countries have decided that they are no longer going to use dollars in their trade. They're going to offset their trade against each other's currencies. And that means that the United States currency is no longer the international reserve currency. What that means is that there's a glut of dollars. If we do not transition, we're going to have a situation where the Federal Reserve note fails. And when you have paper currency, which is only paper, when it fails, that means that you can't use it to buy goods and services. What happens is, first, it just loses its value overnight. The prices double and triple. I was in Argentina when their currency failed. I was in Nigeria when their currency failed. What you do is you go around with a pile of bills this thick because it's only paper. And then at a certain point, there's nothing to buy anymore. And that's why those FEMA camps are there. But there's no reason for us to expect the Federal Reserve note to sit there and wait for it to crash. All we have to do is exchange it for the Treasury dollars, uncut Treasury dollars that are in the global debt facility that were actually printed by Ronald Reagan. And he decided not to issue them because John Hinckley shot him. Now, there are also people who say, well, Karen, how can you possibly be telling the truth on any of this? Wouldn't you meet with some kind of a suicide event? And the fact of the matter is that I have always been working together with this Coalition for the Rule of Law. And for that reason, the consequences, if something were to happen to me, would be that somebody else would take my place. And we would just, all of us, work together in this Coalition for the Rule of Law. Now, this coalition, the network can only continue if there's secrecy. When people see what they're doing, when Toto the dog pulls back the curtain on the wizard and people realize that what they thought was reality was only the wizard's projection screen, it doesn't work. And what's actually happened in the military is I went to Tokyo in the summer because the United States is also defending Japan, which doesn't have its own army and navy. And Japan doesn't want to lose its defense because the Federal Reserve note crashes. So they've been actually working very hard, along with our other allies, to help the United States get rid of this state capture. And so we see that Martin Dempsey, who's the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he had town hall meetings. The first one was on December 2nd, 2013. Then he had one March a year ago. And then he had another town hall meeting. And it was on the 10th of March. So just, I don't know when this broadcast is going to be airing, but 10 minutes before he was supposed to answer the questions, he backed out. So if Martin Dempsey can't answer the question why we don't switch out of Federal Reserve notes before they crash, do we want to unilaterally surrender the United States military might? If he can't answer that question, it's very clear that he's working for the network of global corporate control. He's not interested in his real job. So I think we need a different Joint Chief of Staff. Now, the thing about John Reimer is that when there was this false flag where they were going to detonate a nuclear device off on the citizens of Charleston, John Reimer, I went to him and I asked him to reinstate Tim Giardina, Vice Admiral Tim Giardina, and Michael Carey, Major General Michael Carey, because these patriots, rather than dropping a nuclear device on the citizens of Charleston, detonated this off the coast. And they were fired for a pretext. They were fired for poker chips or some other excuse. And so I went to John Reimer and I said, you have got to reinstate these heroes. And he wouldn't do that. So the Inspector General of the Department of Defense is also clearly working for the network of global corporate control and not for the citizens of the United States. So they're exposed now, and there's no way they're going to continue when citizens understand what it is that they're doing instead of their proper jobs, defending the United States. It's a very serious thing. Now, getting back to Japan, so I issued a press release in July, and what I said was that Japan did not want for the United States military to unilaterally surrender. And because there's something called the Joint U.S.-Japan Committee under the Status of Forces Agreement, that meant that the military was not in the direct chain of command of these Knights of Malta. And therefore, I explained to the military attaché in the Tokyo embassy, that's Mr. O'Leary, I explained to him that we didn't have to relinquish Germany as an ally. All we had to do was to get rid of the Federal Reserve, and Germany would stay our ally. And so he sent me back, the next day he sent me an email which was unclassified, saying that he acknowledged the discussion. Now, I've also gone on record with the third largest business website in Germany, because Germany flew a helicopter over the U.S. consulate in Frankfurt. And when I had this interview, we were talking about the significance of that event. They did this to get our attention, and they certainly have gotten our attention. And when people are asking the candidates in the presidential election coming up in 2016, what's going on with nuclear devices detonating off the coast and firing the heroes that refuse to nuke United States citizens, I don't think we're going to have to wait too long before we actually retire the Federal Reserve notes, which is what we need to do. And when we do that, and as I said, the likelihood that we do that is 90 to 95%, there will be a transition to Asia, but it will happen gradually. It won't happen via World War III. When Jacek Kugler was talking to me at the World Bank about this power transition model, he said that we had to work very quickly because there was a very strong likelihood there would be a nuclear war in the Middle East. Now, we have actually avoided that. That would have been in Syria. And the way we avoided it was I got my statement up about the corruption at the World Bank in the UK Parliament website. And there's another World Bank whistleblower named Elaine Colville. She's Scottish, And she had been working for one of the World Bank organizations called the International Finance Corporation. And she was also reporting double accounting. And she couldn't get anybody to pay attention to her. What we found out was that the accountants and the lawyers, they're self-policing. Well, they're actually part of this corruption. I found out that the American Bar Association is actually very much complicit with a network of global corporate control. And we're going to have to do some very serious reforms. And one of the reforms that we're going to have to seriously consider is whether the lawyers ought to be policing themselves. Obviously, they shouldn't. They don't seem to know what ethics are. It turns out that the best lawyers are actually people who are trying to figure out what's going on. One of the things that this network of global corporate control has done is when children are born, they take the birth certificates, they estimate how many taxes that baby is going to be generating over that baby's lifetime. In the United States, they figure it's about $900,000. And they put a bond on the capital markets and earn money on the birth certificates. And there are some citizens who have figured this out, and they've been providing training to other citizens. And so what was going on is that the courts, which, as I mentioned in the previous broadcast, are actually hidden administrative courts. They're not real courts. The judges are not real judges. What happens is that if you go to court, those judges are really going to come down very hard on these people who have figured out what this scam is. And so they've thrown some very good people in jail to try to intimidate them. And it's not working. These people, when they come out, they actually they have a bigger audience. And so this secrecy is not continuing. It's only a matter of time that we get to figure out what it is that we want to do. And the reforms are going to have to be very carefully considered. What I'm suggesting is that people get together with their friends, people that they like to speak with, and have like book clubs, but it would be more serious than book clubs. It would be talking about what needs to happen in the local communities. What we're going to be talking about in currency is we're not going to be having interest on country debt anymore. We're going to have a special form of currency where gold is spread very, very thin and put in a plastic envelope so that it handles like paper, but you actually have the exact amount of gold that is on the face of the bill. And what we also need to have is we need to have local currencies. You have them in some local areas already, but when all of the municipalities, the businesses agree on a local currency, what that does is that creates full employment. And so we need to have more of that. We need to get rid of what's called legal tender laws, where somebody is telling you what's legal for a buyer or a seller to use in their currency. We need to get rid of that, and so that people would be free to either use local currency or this ORM. And the ORM, it's not like one world currency. Each of the national currencies is going to be out of this gold from the global debt facility. I have been offering this to the various countries, and 3 of the countries have named their negotiating teams. One of them is Taiwan. But I have said that there are some preconditions that we all need to take care of before we can actually go forward. We have to inventory what all of this wealth is in the global debt facility. That's one of the things. We have to have a clear understanding that this currency is going to the people. It's not going to be hoarded. It's not going to be diverted. So we have to have those conditions in place. And there are a few other things, but there has to be transparency. I can't be involved in trying to decide what it is that needs to happen. This is something that all of the people have to decide for themselves. But there is one thing that I feel very strongly about, and that is that whistleblowers need to be protected, because that's the only way that you will find out what's actually going on. That's the only way you will find out whether the reforms that you are trying to put into place are taking hold or whether they're not. So this is going to be an exciting future for all of us, and I'm very much looking forward to telling you how we're doing in this transition from the network of global corporate control to the Coalition for the Rule of Law. Thank you.